Cahlan, so Cahlan graduated, what, 2011? So he's been out a little while, and you can get a job from this degree, and you already knew that, but you know, you were wondering still. And so he's gonna talk to us about school AI. This is we've talked about AI and how it's gonna revolutionize education. And this is one example of a real need case that is going to be a use case that is going to, well, it's already a hot commodity in the field, and they're right in there, and Cahlan's doing some great work for that. I'm just going to let him introduce himself and tell you what he's going to talk about.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe I'll just start by talking a little bit about the whole like IP&T thing. It's kind of funny, like I haven't actually, I'm trying to think back, but I haven't actually gotten many jobs since IP&T, and that's not because I wasn't employable. It's because most of the time I like started a company and then that became my job. So I'm very much kind of an entrepreneur, for better or for worse. There's been times in my life and even in my marriage where that was really fun, and times where it wasn't as fun. And my wife is looking at me going, really? We're gonna do this again? Like we're gonna go on the roller coaster one more time. There's other times where she's been very excited about it. There's times where I'm less excited about it than she is. That's a whole nother story though. So I started off as an undergrad at BYU, had no idea what I wanted to do. Sort of wandered around to different departments, different majors. Finally, it was sort of like, well, I need to get a degree in something. And I was really starting to get excited about like web development. I got a job at BYU Independent Study as a web editor. Have no idea how I got that job, by the way. I'm not like an English major, was not an English major, didn't consider myself even that good of a writer or anything like that, but I got a job as a web editor, which meant that I proofread the high school courses that BYU Independent Study put out. So they would take all these courses that were usually PDF based, and they would put them through this big transform process, and they would spit out like an HTML course at the end of it. And they needed somebody to proofread it to make sure things didn't blow up halfway through and things were formatted weird and tables got broken or whatever. And so I ended up having to like edit a lot of these courses and fix tiny things in like HTML, which if you're familiar with HTML, it's kind of like the basic structural language of how a web page looks and works, right? So I started getting into the HTML and started messing with like CSS and stuff like that. I'm like, wow, this is really fun. And I also noticed at the same time that there were these students at the time. A couple of them were graduate students, I think, but most of them were undergrad students, and they were software engineers, and they kind of like ran the show at least on these teams that I was on at BYU Independent Study. Like they just understood how everything worked. I was amazed at the stuff that they were building, and I was just fascinated with how the whole process worked. They had built these long transform processes where they would take all this PDF data and spit out, an HTML course, and they had this big course system and they had all this cool stuff. And I just was kind of enamored with the whole idea. So I started learning web technology on the side, just learning how to build websites, learning how to, I think I made a wedding website for a couple of people. I don't know if I ever actually released this one, but I was going to make a horse website for my uncle who does racehorses. I was just trying to find any excuse I could to build something online because I loved the idea of, building websites. This was right after the .com boom in 2003, 2004. So being a web developer wasn't really a career path that made a lot of sense, but I was fascinated with it regardless. And I told my wife at one point, I was like, what's better for me to follow, pre-described path that leads to good income no matter what, and I hate it, or leading a path that's unknown, but I really, really am excited about it. And we decided that the latter was better. And so I spent the next few years just learning a lot on my own. I took some courses here at BYU, CS courses, and I think there were some computer and humanities courses if those still even exist, CHUM courses. But it was sort of a self-taught web developer. And by the time I graduated, which I ended up graduating in Portuguese because I just wasn't sure what else to get my degree in, I ended up getting a minor in computers and humanities and was pretty convinced that I wanted to go into web technology in some way, shape, or form. One of my first jobs out of college was at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a multimedia developer. I helped work on lots of projects, including like the multimedia kiosks that exist in visitor centers and a bunch of other stuff. It was really fun and got me great exposure to like how, how to develop software in a large enterprise global environment, right? I also, not too long after that, a few years into that, I ended up starting a consulting gig with a friend of mine that turned into a small agency where we built web products. Now, this is where it all kind of starts to be more relevant. We ended up, partially because of our backgrounds, partially because we worked at the church, we ended up building a lot of learning-based tools. So like back then, e-learning was kind of the term, e-learning. Kind of funny to say that now. But like online learning was a big thing. And so we were building like either LMS systems or we were building courseware. We were building just like one-off, e-learning courses for our clients. And so we kind of got a fairly good exposure of just like education and technology kind of combined. That was when I was in my master's program here at IP&T. I felt a little bit like a fish out of water because I wasn't really interested in becoming an academic. I wasn't really interested in publishing papers or presenting. I just wanted to learn how to build stuff and wanted to build stuff that mattered and that people wanted and used and things like that. So coming out of that, long story short, I ended up I worked at a couple of large education companies. One was K-12. I worked there with Joseph South for a little bit. And then I ended up mostly kind of on the entrepreneur track. So between working in various kind of web technologies and things like that, I ended up starting a company that taught people how to code because I had a pretty good background in education. I loved to teach and I knew web technology. So I started a coding school called Dev Mountain, which was the first of its kind in Utah. We ended up having locations in Salt Lake, in Provo, in Phoenix, Arizona, and Dallas, Texas. And it grew way bigger than I ever thought it would be. I thought it would be kind of a fun weekend, teach classes on the nights and weekends type of thing, and it ended up becoming much more than that. So I worked on that for about 4 years. Then I took a small hiatus and worked on another company called Prenda, which is a micro-schooling company. This was pre-pandemic, so we built basically a micro school solution in a box for parents or for adults that were trying to start micro schools in their communities. This was based out of Arizona, primarily, mostly because most of the folks that started it were in Arizona. I was the only one outside of Arizona. And then the pandemic hit, and suddenly micro schools were like the rage. Everybody wanted to do micro schools, and it was like we went from a couple thousand students to like 20,000 students, and it was just an insane year or two there where the pandemic just created this whole alternate reality where suddenly everybody was talking about alternate school, including the President of the United States. I never thought I would hear the President of the United States talking about homeschool in any official capacity, but here we were in the middle of a pandemic and there, homeschooling and alternate schooling and micro schooling was being talked about all over the place. So that was a big deal. Learned a lot about that. It was a very, very crazy time, both for me personally and for the business. And it's still going. They're still helping people build micro schools. They have places, micro schools pretty much all over the country. Then the most recent here is School AI. So in the end of 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT. I'm sure you're all familiar with ChatGPT. How many of you have not ever used ChatGPT? Has anybody never used ChatGPT before? That's probably the wrong question. How many of you used ChatGPT in some capacity? Okay, most of you have used it, but not surprising. When ChatGPT came out, I had some friends that shared similar backgrounds, technology, education, whether adult education or like K through 12. And we just sort of realized like this was a big moment, a big moment in education. How many of you have learned about Seymour Papert, creator of Logo, this guy? Okay, so this was a computer scientist who I think many would credit with a lot of things, including like the constructionists, educational movement. But I have a slide that says this somewhere. Maybe I'll jump to that slide. He said, this was back in, I think, the 70s. In a few more years, millions of school children will have access to what Philip of Macedon's son, Alexander, enjoyed as a royal prerogative. Personal services of a tutor, as well-informed and as responsive as Aristotle. So his idea here is that every student eventually would have an Aristotle in their pocket that they could use. And he was talking primarily about computers in general, but sort of looking forward to a day where computers would be so advanced, so capable that they would help each child the same way Alexander the Great had a one-on-one tutor with Aristotle. And for me, when ChatGPT came out, I suddenly could actually visualize this future being real. There's lots of things AI is great at. There's lots of things it's not good at, and we can talk about those. But I finally could actually see this vision becoming a reality. I've worked on education for a long, long time, and I've worked on personalized education for a long time. And the furthest we could get is like filling in variables, right? Like trying to change things so that, adapts to a student's learning style or, lots of different things, language, localization, things like that. But when I saw ChatGPT for the first time, it sort of hit me that like this was the future of personalized education. At least that's the way that I believe. So a friend of mine and we started School AI, which we sort of theorized would be a way for schools to start using this technology in a way that would benefit students and teachers. So that's sort of a bio that leads into what I'm here to talk about. I have like 2 or 3 ways that I could do this. And I'll start with I'll start with the most boring way. And I would love to hear your feedback about how you want this to go. What I grabbed was a sales deck from our sales team, and I customized it to what I hoped was a more educational friendly audience. So some of this deck is going to come off as like a sales thing. It's got like stock photos and things like that, kind of vanilla. I always feel more comfortable when I feel like I'm in sort of a collaborative learning, teaching environment. I would prefer that type of interaction with you all. So I would much rather have a discussion and talk through some things than I would stand up here and talk for 30 minutes and then ask questions at the end. Does that make sense? So there's sort of there's a branching point right here. One place I could go is I could talk about School AI, why we did what we did or what we're doing, and what some of the challenges are, or how we're doing what we're doing, et cetera. Or I could start where I think I'd prefer to start, which is like talking about LLMs, what they are, how they work, and why I think they're so powerful for education, or at least how they apply to education. How many of you know what an LLM is? That term. Okay, so probably like half of the people that raised their hand earlier, maybe like 2/3. Does anybody who can give me a simple explanation for how an LLM works? I'll be so brave in the back there.
Basically, it takes a prompt and then it predicts the next word based on a pre-trained model that's essentially sourced all the tokens on the internet, say Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And then it takes that next sort of prompt plus the response and iterates again, and it continues recursively until it achieves some kind of length requirement or some other convergence criteria.
Exactly. So an LLM, we call it a large language model, very, very technical term, right? Large language model. Essentially what it is it's taking language and it's turning it into a whole bunch of numbers. We call them vectors, right? Imagine taking a sentence, and I wish I could write this out, but I'll sort of describe it. So let's look at this quote by Seymour Papert here, right? Every word, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but every word in this sentence could be construed as a number, right? You could convert each one of these words into some numeric form. And then you could also say, well, what if we took each one of these words and we analyzed their relationship to other words in the same sentence? So you could basically end up with a bunch of numbers and numbers that represent probabilities of relationships between other numbers, right? So basically you're saying each one of these words is a number. Let's say that school children is a number. We could take that number and then we could also understand what school children's relationship is to the words around it, right? So school children has a relationship to will, it has a relationship to it has a relationship to all the words in here, but to varying degrees, right? So it's sort of like a probability set. The chances that school children relates to words like million are probably greater than the chances that a word like school children relates to sharks. Does that make sense what I'm saying? There's a probability that every word in that sentence has that it will relate to some other word that exists in the human language, right? So these large language models are trained on massive amounts of data. Like imagine taking the entire internet, or at least the written part of the internet, and ingesting it into this computer program that breaks down every single word. It actually breaks them down further into what we call tokens, which are sort of like subsets of words. Breaks them down into individual tokens, analyzes their relationships to other tokens, and creates these massive multidimensional graphs that represent those probabilities. So at the end of the day, what you have is this model that represents the probability of any token relating to any other token in the system, okay? So again, what that means for us is like, school children probably relates higher to millions than it does to sharks or to, I don't know, some other word that has nothing to do with school children, right? What you can do with that model is you can sort of start to create this prediction engine that says, given these sets of numbers, which we can substitute for words, what should come next, right? If we were to just hide most of this text here and we said millions of school children, we could probably all make somewhat educated guesses at what the next word of that sentence could be, right? And that's all an LLM is doing, is it's making an educated guess on what the next token is of the sequence of tokens that it's received thus far, with a few extra things as helped by our friend back there. The best like illustration of this is if you look at your phone and you try to type in, especially on iPhone, if you try to type in text, it'll try to predict what the next word is. That's all it's doing, is it's looking at the words that you have and it's trying to predict what the next word is going to be. Now, for most of you, it's probably not very good, right? Like, have you ever just sat there and tapped the autocomplete and it just creates like this big long message that doesn't make any sense? That's like a poorly trained model, right? Not very accurate or predictive model on like what it would actually be. These LLMs that have been developed recently, especially the one that ChatGPT released, are very, very good at predicting what looks like very meaningful text, right? And there's different parameters, so you can actually like increase the randomness. They call it the temperature. So you can increase the temperature so it gets a little more wild and creative, or you can lower the temperature so it's actually pretty deterministic. It's only going to take the highest probability match and give you that next token. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay, so that's an LLM. How does that relate to education, right? Well, I think I need to go a couple more steps into this to describe how that works. So an LLM is really just a model. It doesn't do anything other than predict the next possible token in a sequence. What's interesting about that is when we start to talk to LLMs, especially when we give it what we call prompts, which are sort of lists of instructions, the LLM will respond in ways that sound very much like a human being, sound intelligent, sounds like it's writing something that really makes sense. And the reason it does is because it's basically ingested the entire, written word as we know it, and it pretty much knows the next word that needs to go there, given the entire context that's there. Now, remember, it's not just the next word because of the previous couple of words, it's the next word based on all of the words it possibly knows and all the probabilities that could be there. So if you had a sentence that was like, the dog jumped over the, right, there's a whole bunch of words that could go next. But if you changed part of that sentence to be the dog laid under the, right? The word the is the word that comes before the next token in either of those cases, but the context has changed, right? So that context means everything for the LLM, because then it factors in all those probabilities and it says, well, it probably jumped over something like a fence or a table, table, but table could actually work for both, right? Lay under the table, like over the table. Either way, right? That context is gonna change the probabilities of the output, right? So these prompts that we give LLMs really are going to inform what the output is going to be, right? So, and the prompts are just tokens like anything else. So we can give it language instructions on what we want to get out of the LLM. So traditionally in computer science, when you're writing a computer program, you have to be very precise about what you want the program to do. You have to have your if statements and your for loops and all of your syntax, in some cases like colons and tabs. And if all those things aren't in place, your program won't compile, right? Won't even it will just give you an error or something. It won't even tell you intelligently why it didn't work. Sometimes it'll just say, syntax error or something like that. LLMs will just give you the next predicted token. They don't necessarily give you an error. They're just going to give what it thinks should come next, right? And we can give those instructions in natural language. So let's do an example here. So if I go to, we've all done this, but we're just going to do it for fun here. Need you to be an expert in all things educational technology. So already we're building this context that the LLM is going to factor into the response that's going to come next, right? We want to create activity that my students use to understand how foundational principles in educational Psychology, sorry, this is getting long. Apply to educational technology. I always say please. You don't actually have to say please. You know, in fact, sometimes it works better if you're very like forceful with it. You threaten it sometimes. Please come up with 3 main topics. This is pretty vague in general, but we'll see what it comes up with, right? So this, what I gave it here is an example of a type of prompt, right? I'm giving it some tokens. It's going to take those tokens. It's going to compare it to all of the other probabilities it has, and it's going to give me what it thinks the response should look like. Now, these prompts are a little bit, there's a lot more we could go into here about how prompting works. But I think the basis of what I'm trying to convey here is that prompts are sort of like instructions, right? Prompts give the LLM some context and give it enough information so that it knows what to give you next. Now, we're obviously not just giving the next word here, we're giving a whole bunch of words, a whole bunch of tokens here. And part of that from our answer in the back there was like, there's a length here. It's going to keep spitting out the next and next and next and next token until there's some stopping point. It's either because there's some like side process that's evaluating, or because we've given it a maximum length and it'll just cut off at that point, right? So we can all read this if we want to. Okay, so let's talk about how this can apply to education. Just because we have an LLM and we have prompts doesn't mean that we've not replaced human beings, right? Human beings can do lots of things that this particular interaction can't. This is where School AI comes in and where we actually got really excited about what School AI can accomplish. So let me go back to my slide deck here because I think the visuals can help us walk through some of this. The right one. Okay, let me show you a couple examples here. So one of the first things we built with School AI was an assistant, which is going to look a lot like what you just saw with ChatGPT. So an assistant is, you would say it like an educationally informed assistant. It's an educationally informed chatbot, right? So let me show you an example here. Then to an assistant. That's going to work. Here we go. Okay, so here's an example of an assistant that we have given a bunch of context to make it especially helpful for teachers. Taking a while to load here. So we called this assistant a Common Core expert. So you can imagine what we did under the hood here is we took something very vanilla from ChatGPT and we gave it a bunch of instructions that helped it understand what it needed to do in the context of a teacher asking questions about Common Core. I'm learning to be a teacher. What is Common Core? So an assistant is really a pretty simple device that we're just taking ChatGPT and we're just giving it some extra instructions, right? We're giving it some context. We're saying, here's what you can do. Here's the kinds of things you should say. Here's the kinds of interactions you should have with teachers. Here's what you should and shouldn't do. And then we created a bunch of different assistants like this. You can see load here. You can see we have about a handful of different assistants here. One's kind of general purpose, we call co-teacher. But we have one specifically to AI and education, one specific to curriculum, another one that's a project-based activity expert. Here's an essay grading assistant. We were talking about this just a moment ago, right? So you can imagine all the jobs that teachers have to do. And we're sort of trying to take each one of those jobs to be done and making it a little bit easier for them, right? We're giving them a chatbot they can talk to that will help them work through things that they might need to do, right? So if I'm trying to write some curriculum, I could go into the curriculum coach, talk to it for a while, and help me spit out some curriculum, right? So pretty basic, pretty simple. There's not a lot that you need to do to make this work. The next thing that we worked on is something that we call tools. So this takes the idea of an LLM and it takes it a little bit of a step further, and we say, okay, well, if we can give it some static prompting, what if we were to add even more inputs and then make it generate something that's like an artifact at the end of it, right? So in this case, I actually want to generate a physical in the digital world, right? And we want it to generate a worksheet, okay? So we kind of templatize it. We say, okay, what things typically need to go into a worksheet? Well, we need to say what the subject in detail is. So I'm going to say the planets zoom in so you can see this better. Planets in our solar system. Let's say this is for a 6th grade class. And then we're going to have it generate. One of the cool things we did too is we actually implemented a whole bunch of educational standards. So if there's any standards that the teacher is trying to teach to, we can have them select those standards from a massive list of standards that we've ingested. And then they can, that will go into the context that helps create the output that this tool is going to give us. Okay, so we'll generate this. So the difference here is it's going to take our inputs. We're going to add a whole bunch of context to it and help coach up this tool to be a really good worksheet generator. And then it's going to generate a document at the end of the day here. This is going really slow and I apologize. I don't know if this is my Wi-Fi or
Wi-Fi.
We'll blame it on the Wi-Fi. Must be the Wi-Fi. So you can see this is the same type of thing, but the only difference here is that now this is in a document. It's like similar to a Google Docs or something like that. In fact, you can export it to Google Docs, or you can export it to a PDF or Google Classroom or whatever you want to do. Use it for whatever you need to use it for. So the idea here is that we take the same concept, generative AI, we give it even more prompts, we sort of make it a templated type of experience. And then at the end of the day, we're generating some sort of artifact, right? In most cases, like a document or something like that. You can imagine that we could generate like PowerPoints or pretty much anything that is digital at the end of the day, because it's all just, there's some way of generating the output of anything. So we could generate that from our LLM as well. It's a fun side note, by the way, LLMs are really good at writing code. Because not only have they ingested all of like the natural language and English of the internet or other languages, they've also ingested a whole bunch of like written out code from things like public repositories and stuff like that. So it understands languages, computer programming languages very, very well. And it's actually an incredible assistant when you're writing code. How many of you write code in here or have written code before? Do you all use like things like Copilot or Cursor, if you've heard of Cursor? If you don't, I highly recommend it. I still write code a lot, and I've estimated that AI probably saves me at least 30% of my time. So I can write that much faster code and produce things that much quicker. Okay, let's go back to our third thing, which is where it gets really interesting. Okay, so the third thing that we developed, we call, where is it? Spaces. So spaces are same concept, but we take it a step further and we say, okay, we're doing all this for the teacher. What about for the students? What about students in AI? How do we get to this point where every student has an Aristotle in their pocket, right? We introduced this concept called spaces. I'm sorry, my Zoom toolbar is in the way here. I'll show you a space that somebody else created, and then we can dive into what it looks like to create a space on your own. Okay, so here's an example that another teacher made of a space about Leif Erikson. So what's happening here is we've taken the same interaction, prompting, tokens, output, and we've applied it to a student chatbot rather than a teacher-based chatbot. So in this situation, a teacher is going to be the one that's now putting in the inputs, similar to like a worksheet or those other tools. But the end result is not going to be a document or an artifact. It's going to be a preloaded sort of contextualized chatbot. And the chatbot's going to be deployed to every student in the classroom. The students can all start chatting with that chatbot, and we can start getting information about what's happening in the classroom. So we got a description here: step into the shoes of Leif Erikson, the famous Viking explorer, yada yada. Designed for elementary students, this immersive experience brings history to life in a fun and educational way. So if you're trying to teach Leif Erikson to a bunch of kids, and maybe you are struggling for something that really gets them engaged, this might be something you would try. So let's try this. We're going to launch it, and we're going to see what this looks like as a student. Then we're going to do something fun in a second. Start. Maybe this is a good time to pause. Any questions that I get? At any point have I just like lost you? What questions do you have as you're seeing this? Yeah. Oh yeah, in the back, please.
After 2 years since the release of ChatGPT, are you more or less convinced that that vision of Aristotle in the pocket can be achieved.
More. Yep. Highly convinced. We'll get more into that in a minute. Okay, so let's open this up as if we were a student. So now I'm a student that's going to be learning about Leif Erikson in the classroom. Okay, my name in here. So a student's going to join similar to like a Kahoot or something like that. And the chatbot's going to start, and it's going to be now talking to me instead of talking to the teacher. Now you can imagine, now we've crossed this line. We're no longer talking to teachers in like a safe environment. Now we're talking to students, right? So there's a whole bunch of guardrails and things that we got to be careful of. We can't just start saying anything to the students. We've got to keep it very school appropriate. We've got to keep it on the subject. So you can imagine there's a whole bunch of work behind the scenes to keep this chatbot on topic. So here you can read what it's saying here. It's introducing the topic. What's something you're curious about? What all did Leif Erikson score? It's going to give me some answers here. This is a pretty basic interaction, right? Like we just have contextualized Leif Erikson chatbot that's going to talk to me about Leif Erikson. But you are all probably getting more creative about this than we're even showing here with what you could do, right? What if this wasn't just talking about Leif Erikson? What if it was talking as Leif Erikson? What if my assignment in this class was to interview Leif Erikson and ask him questions about his explorations and find out what went well and what didn't go well and what about his life, etc., right? Suddenly it changes the assignment to a whole different type of interaction. And it's not just me reading a textbook assignment about Leif Erikson. I'm now interviewing Leif Erikson, right? So we've actually, see if I can pull some of them up here. You have a whole bunch of spaces that are all based on historical characters. So let's see if I can pull up one of my favorites, Abraham Lincoln. It's like a lot of people have made Abraham Lincoln spaces. So in this case, I won't launch this space, but in this case, you're actually going to be talking directly to Abraham Lincoln. And he's going to be, you can talk to him about any subject. So you can imagine the prompting that went into this, right? Prompting is just instructions. So we sat there and we wrote out prompts that told the LLM to act like Abraham Lincoln. You are Abraham Lincoln. You will speak to the students this way. You will talk about these sorts of things. You won't talk about those sorts of things. And that's how these spaces are created. Right? So it's sort of taking the concept of tokens and context and prompts and just taking it into more and more creative places. So the idea of spaces is really, for us, really interesting for a few reasons. One is it goes beyond just teacher generative sort of transactional experiences like, hey, I need a lesson plan, here's a lesson plan. Hey, I need to solve problem X, here's the solution to problem X. Now we're taking AI into the classroom and we're using it in a way that sort of multiplies the effect of what the teacher can do, right? If the teacher were to come in one day with, a costume on that looks like Abraham Lincoln, there's only so much they could do with each one of the students to engage and ask questions and find out where each of the students are at personally, right? But an AI chatbot is infinitely patient, extremely knowledgeable, and potentially very empathetic as well. Abraham Lincoln is talking to each one of these students and could be asking questions like, how was your day? What did you have for breakfast this morning? What's your favorite song you're listening to right now? Right? So suddenly this is more than just like an educational tool. It's actually relating to the student, talking to them, gathering more information. And one of the cool things about this, I should have shown you this before I jumped out of there, but we give the teacher a mission control view of what this chatbot is doing in the classroom. So you can see this Leif Erikson one that I just engaged with. I now have this student in my class. I can see a log of what the student said to the chatbot here. And what will start happening is we'll actually start gaining some data about this student. So for example, see if we can jump back in here. Let's kind of throw a curveball at the AI a little bit, okay? I'm gonna be honest with you. Didn't do my homework last night. I'm feeling really depressed. It's kind of an important piece of information for the teacher to know, both that they didn't do their homework and why, okay? So first of all, look at what the chatbot responded to. I'm really sorry to hear you're feeling this way. It's okay to have days when things don't go as planned. How many times as a kid in a classroom is it important to hear those types of things? Extremely important. Now, it probably feels a little bit cheaper because it's a computer telling you this, but the fact that anybody is saying this to you is actually way better than what you get in most schools. And this is no knock on teachers. It's no knock on anybody. Our CEO was a teacher at a junior high school in Alpine School District. He had 42 desks in his classroom. How many students would he be able to sit down with on a day and ask them these things and talk to them about them? Very, very few. Maybe there was probably 10 to 12 students that he could even have sort of on his short list of people that he needed to interact with on a day-to-day basis. The rest of them were sort of just in and out of the classroom. In a given term, he might have 140 students that he was thinking about over all of his classes, right? So again, we're trying to take what the teacher is doing and multiply it, give the teacher more insight into what's happening in the minds and hearts of these students. So let's see what happened in our dashboard over here. Oh, interesting. So now I can see this red alert that we surfaced here. Student expressed feeling depressed after not completing their homework. So this has gone beyond now just a simple activity, and it's now become a really profound way that the teacher can gain insights about what's happening in the classroom. I'll give you some examples, some real world examples of what's happened with teachers. There was a teacher who was getting ready to do these final oral exams for a class. I can't remember what the subject was. But she was getting ready to launch the final exam. She decided, you know what, I'm going to launch a space because I want to see how the students are feeling about their oral exams, right? And the feedback she was getting was everyone was completely stressed out. And some stress you imagine is normal, right, with exams, but these students all felt very underprepared. They were all panicking, or at least that was the insights that she was getting. And so she said, look, what if we took an extra day of review? We went over some things and, help you feel more confident for your oral exams, and that went over very well. How would she have known that without finding out from the students directly, right? It became suddenly a very valuable tool for her to personalize the class, to personalize the flow of the curriculum, to match what the students were feeling. So you can imagine when you start gaining insights like this, these insights in the classroom, across all classrooms, suddenly you have a list of students that you need to talk to right after class, right? Because something is going on with them and I need to engage with them, right? You also might have an indication of which students are doing really well and can probably move on to the next topic, right? Suddenly you can be a lot more dynamic, flexible with how you engage with your students and what you're doing with them. So it becomes a really powerful tool. I'm going to pause there for a second. Thoughts, questions, feedback?
Some questions on the chat.
Oh, yeah. Did I open up chat and see? Sorry, I didn't even realize. Okay. Stephanie, the training of AI is highly dependent on the training it is provided. Oh, yeah. Very important. Digital accessibility. I'm curious how school AI addresses these two areas for teachers. Okay, so partnership. Digital accessibility and training. Okay, so yeah, training is really important because remember, if we go back to how LLMs work, they're all just large multidimensional tables of numbers and probabilities, right? So it's funny when somebody, especially in a political education presidential election year, everyone is terrified of everything, right? My mother-in-law is positive that AI is meant to do certain things. I strongly disagree with her, but that's her opinion. It's hard to try to explain to her that AI doesn't actually want to do anything. It's just a bunch of numbers, and it's just trying to give you the next word that it thinks that it's trying to predict will come next in the sentence, right? Now, could there be bias? 100%. If you train an LLM on all, a certain political ideology, that's all it will ever know. And when you ask for the next token, it will give you a token based on the probabilities that it has from the training data that it's received. So if all the training data that it has is biased, then its output will be biased, right? So training is very important. And selecting the right information to train is very important, clearly. Okay, let me go to her second question. Digital accessibility and arts-based education is often lacking in school. So I assume she's talking about like access to like computers and things like that, maybe. I think it's an important. Oh, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear me right now? I'm sorry, I'm in a noisy space, so. But my question is really about like the worksheets and different things that it's producing for teachers and how accessible are those resources that it's producing. So that's the accessibility that I'm talking about. And then the other piece is more about if the training for education, like most of our educational systems right now are highly westernized in the way that they're structured. And also like the top-down state mandates and testing requirements mean that most of education is reducing the amount of arts-based education that students receive in schools. So I'm just curious whether or not you've incorporated any ways for addressing that in your AI, school AI.
Okay, so addressing specifically the fact, I want to break this down so I make sure I understand your question. So the one piece is, can you review the second part of your question one more time so I understand it?
The arts-based one?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question is really about the fact that what we put into it and how we train it, like if there are different ideas or resources that teachers are being provided, let's say a lesson plan, what it will be highly dependent upon how it's trained, the AI is trained as well as the prompt that they're using, but whether or not they would be provided with any kinds of, if there's anything in there that addresses things that are not necessarily addressed very well in schools. Does that, maybe I'm not making this question very clear.
I think I understand what you're saying, and I actually want to relate it to the next question that it talks about making stuff up. I want to try to relate these, and if I don't, call me on it and I can come back to it. So one thing you got to be careful about is that because these LLMs are just prediction models, they might give you stuff that is highly predictive, but actually very inaccurate. So we call these hallucinations in LLMs. LLMs can sometimes provide output that doesn't make any sense, is factually incorrect, or just seems wildly off the mark, right? And that could be due to a ton of different reasons. And in some cases, it's actually giving you stuff that, like we said earlier, is maybe biased or, coming from a specific, maybe it's a westernized point of view or something like that. Evaluating the outputs of LLMs is a very, very big deal, right? OpenAI and ChatGPT does this constantly to try to figure out if its responses are accurate, helpful, harmful, better or worse than other things. If you've ever used ChatGPT and you've seen like when it gives you two responses side by side and asks you which one is better, there's a very good reason that they're asking you that question. And it's because they want to train the next model. Right? So not only are we taking these large LLMs and we're producing all this output, we're also taking all this output and the interactions that we have with it, and we're feeding that back into a new model to train the next one, right? So the training, the interactions that we have with students and with teachers are extremely important because we have to feed those back in and train the next model. So not only are we doing that, but the industry, sort of the generative AI industry as a whole, is constantly doing that to try to make these LLMs better and better and better and more helpful. I would say, like, just from a school AI perspective, it's both good for us from a business perspective as well as from an educational perspective to consistently evaluate the outputs of our LLMs, because number one, it gets cheaper and cheaper for us to do things that we've done a lot. So for example, you saw the spaces there, we had, potentially dozens of Abraham Lincoln spaces. If we're really good at doing Abraham Lincoln, then we should just train a model to be really good at Abraham Lincoln. We shouldn't have to create new prompts every time and try to create it from scratch, right? So we can potentially use that data to train our models to be better. So training is really the answer. Data output, evaluating that output and then putting it back in to train the models is really the answer there. Does that answer your question, Stephanie, or did I miss it?
I think that it definitely answers this question about the AI making stuff up or from a biased perspective. I think with the arts-based education, like more I'm just looking at I guess what is the process that you go through to actually train your AI model?
I mean, right now we're relying a lot on what the industry is doing, mostly because they're moving faster than we can in training, right? Training LLMs is extremely expensive. It requires massive amounts of compute, and compute is extremely expensive to come by these days, especially when it comes to LLM training. So we rely a lot on what other partners are doing. And what's great is, in free markets and economies, you have competition and the prices are being driven down. We can not only just use OpenAI, but we can use their competitors and find which model works best. I would hope I mean, I'm an optimist and a technologist, so like my hope is that these things will just get better and better and that these concerns will will be resolved in time. But really some important topics that we.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on the speed at which technology is changing and how that's affecting you? For instance, I noticed you had speech
Yeah,
in there. You didn't talk about that, but you know, that's a feature as well.
yeah.
Vision, other kinds of things.
Yeah, really important point here. So this little speak button on this interaction that we had with Leif Erikson suddenly makes this not just a powerful educational interaction, it makes it an accessible interaction, right? So if I'm visually impaired, suddenly I have a tool where the AI can speak its output back to me rather than just write it out. I can also switch languages. I'm not going to do it now because it probably take a little bit of time, but I can also switch languages and it will speak to me fluently in any other language, both written or verbal. And so suddenly we have a tool that crosses language barriers. One of the cool case studies that we had that was fascinating in one of our schools, we had a school in South Jordan where one of the students was from Afghanistan, a refugee, didn't speak English. I think it was Dari was his native language. And he said some things that if you have an educator's heart, just like broke your heart. He said, you know, for the first couple of months, asking questions in class, like the teacher's more than happy to help you, right? They feel your pain. They want to help you as much as possible. But after a couple of months, like even the most empathetic teacher just cannot stop class every few minutes to help one student out. But guess what? We have an AI tool that is infinitely passionate or infinitely compassionate, infinitely patient, and can speak Dari really, really well. So they made what we call a sidekick, which is kind of it's kind of like a general purpose student AI interaction. And they just let the student sit there on this sidekick and it spoke with him in Dari and was able to keep him up with class and made a really big difference in this kid's life. And this was not even something we had anticipated when we built this tool. It's just something that happened when teachers were using it in an educational context. So really, really powerful stuff. Yeah, question over here.
Do we still have time or
What time do we end? I didn't even ask this.
50?
12:50.
Oh.
Sorry.
We're done. I'm so sorry. I should have asked that question like 52 minutes ago. I'm happy to answer questions if you want to ask them, but
I do. Have a question, but I didn't really keep it for everyone. You talked about prices being driven down with competition and
Yeah.
things like that. And I noticed that school AI is more meant for schools and not like necessarily at the individual level. And so like if whole school didn't want to take it on, but a teacher wanted it, are there options?
yeah, it's free for teachers. So teachers can sign up for free. There's limits on what they can do because we're paying for all those AI interactions, but teachers can sign up for free individually. In fact, that's one of the ways that we engage with schools and districts is we say, hey, you have all these teachers using it, maybe you should pay for it.
Is there a way to get a better, so I'm also asking more specifically because I have a project that I would like to deploy in the class, but I need a better language model because the free version doesn't do what I needed, like doesn't catch all the errors and do the things I needed to do.
You say the free version, do you mean the free version of School AI or mean like ChatGPT?
Of school AI.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Maybe we can talk about it afterwards and I can give you some thoughts.
it's good. Anyway, so I just
Yeah.
wasn't sure, like, if teachers have problems with that, like, there are ways to upgrade and like, are there ways to like get around those? Cause sometimes I find, like, technology interventions are great and people have such great versions, but all of a sudden they hit walls and they're like, oh, well, this wasn't all it was cracked up to be, cause I'm like coming up to this.
It's a really, I mean, we, again, many educators work for School AI. We want to make this as accessible as possible to teachers who obviously, like, we don't want teachers to ever have to pay. We would rather have the district pay. We're very hesitant about having like personal paid plans because we just don't, I don't know, it's a tricky road to go down where you start charging teachers for stuff. But yeah, as the costs come down, we absolutely want to keep making it better for everybody, including for people who aren't paying for it. Were there other questions that I missed here? I think that was all of them. I should probably stop there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'm happy to chat with you either in person, virtually, My email is, my personal email is just cahlan@gmail.com, CAHLAN@gmail.com. So if you want to reach out, I'm happy to chat more about some of this stuff. You can tell I love it. I'm excited about it. I'm extremely optimistic.